Greetings! It is I, Tentus Naravan Dracovin, Lord and Emperor of the Dracovin Empire, and welcome. It is time to continue my discussion on D20 Modern, the modern take on the 3rd edition of Dungeons & Dragons. When we last left off, we talked about the advanced classes. Let's dive into a new important task, a more important topic to talk about. Game mastering. Game mastering is very important when it comes to D20 Modern because you're crafting a world much different than, of course, you've crafted in any of the other fantasy-based systems that are based around Dungeons & Dragons. This one is all about very action-heavy set pieces, but set within this sort of urban fantasy setting in a more contemporary setting. The point of it really is to craft games and environments which are going to be entertaining to your players. You want them to have fun. You want them to use their various skills, dice rolls, the combat encounters they have to forge stories for themselves and their characters that you manipulate as the game master in necessary means in order for them to have this great fun time, to feel the thrill of the action, the excitement of the chase, the danger of the beast, the overall kind of action-heavy sets that might occur with gunfights, car chases, and various things, even diving into more some of the fanciful things that you might want to bring in, which are talked about in this book. It's all about these characters being heroes, set in a story where they're doing larger-than-life actions. And the truth is, it will not be realistic. You're not looking for realism here. As much as a fantasy game, you're not looking for realism. It's the same sort of thing here. Even if you don't take in some of those heavy fanciful elements, these characters are going to be like action hero heroic, where they're doing crazy and ridiculous things that normal people should not be able to accomplish. They should feel like, to a degree, they're in an action-adventure movie. Now, as a game master, you have a number of roles that you have to fulfill in order for you to get your job correctly done. Effectively, in order for you to craft the narrative you want, to create the world you want, and have your characters have the most out of the game, have the most amounts of entertainment, and be filled with the most wanting to return to the game afterwards, either continuing the story or start a new one. That's the point of it. You want to craft your game in such a way. First off, you have to build a story. This is important because it has to have a narrative to it. Whether your narrative is over a single session or a campaign of sessions, you have to make sure there is a beginning to this narrative, a middle, and an end. You want them to have some kind of beginning point where they enter into this story, where they establish their characters, a middle point where they've met with what kind of problem they're trying to overcome. They realize it. They may face some defeats at this point in time, they may not, but they've basically been assigned a goal and an end point in time where they finally have gotten to the point where they can accomplish that goal and feel the joy of victory. It's also going to be important for you to set whatever appropriate mood is for the game. Now, you might want a game that's filled with excitement and action-adventure. You also might want to make more of like a horror type game, where there's a lot of suspense and thrills and danger around every corner. Depending on what kind of game you want to establish, you have to establish the mood that's appropriate to it. The fact is, you want your characters to be feeling the mood that is appropriate to the game world. If you're in a horror type atmosphere that you're trying to build out, you don't want people to feel like ready to jump into action and punch something in the face and have that kind of feeling to them. You're going to have it appropriate. But then you also want them to be excited about what's going on. That's the other thing. You have to make sure your characters are excited. This doesn't mean that they necessarily don't have to feel the tension and dread and horror of like a horror game, or the action-heavy excitement of a car chase. It's that they have to be excited for the overall experience. They have to be willing to dive into this experience and encounter it, feel it, be one with it. You also have to be ready, as a game master, to craft your world. Whether you're starting out on a pre-made world / pre-made adventure that's already been established, or you're coming up with something entirely on your own, is up to you. You can use some of the pre-made material just as fine as you can use something that you're making up yourself. Regardless of whether you're using either, whatever you establish as your initial world will be altered by your characters and the events they take place. So the world that you will end up in is going to be vastly different from the world you started with if you made your own, or the world that was in the printed book, because the actions of your characters and what they're going to do is affect that world. And it will be your job to taper that world appropriately to what is going on, to react how the world you're building would react to the very actions they're doing. If they do something that's on a global scale, it will have global repercussions. If you're just doing something that's going to help out a city, well, that city is going to get great. It might have some repercussions in another city nearby, but it might not. The last thing you're going to have to do, of course, is you're going to have to be basically a referee. You're going to have to be a master of not only this balancing between the actual rules of the game, but the control of what your characters are doing within the game. You're going to have to balance it out and control how the actions in the world are without overbearing your characters. You should let your characters make decisions about what they want to do on their own, and then reflect it in the rules that you tell them. Don't stifle them unless it seems proper to stifle them. If they're trying to do something that is ridiculously difficult to do, you have to let them know. It's like, okay, man, this is going to be really tough to do, and I'm going to reflect it when I'm going to tell you here as my rulings. If you want to still try to do it, go ahead. You're going to have to basically control the situations, and especially with disputes that might occur, either between you and the players or the rules, you're going to have to mitigate them very quickly and efficiently. You don't want big disputes to occur. So you as controlling the basic rules and narrative in that way is very important. Let's talk storytelling, because storytelling is the big thing you're going to be doing as a dungeon master. Your storytelling is basically crafting of the story. I talked about that it's important to have a story, but the storytelling of it is the way that you're expressing the story that you're attempting to build. The thing is, you have to remember that it is a collaboration. It's not just you. It is a collaboration between you and your players that the story plays out. I set up part of this scene. They add to the scene. I complete the scene. I now have part of a scene of my story played out. And I did this because what they did drives where the story is going. So this is a collaboration that's constantly ongoing between the two of you, adding more and more to the story and sort of telling the tale of it in the very actions you do between the two of each other in these steps. Now, it's also important to talk about pacing of your game. First off, you're going to have to look at the kind of pace your players are going to want to go at. Each player has a different way of doing things. They might come to the same mission where they have to break into a place. One group of players might want to just break in there right away, bam, bam, bam. Others might want to plan things out. They might want to just come up with an elaborate plan. They might want to gather information. They might want to go on extra smaller missions to stealth things out. These are matters of pacing, and you have to kind of recognize this combination between the pace that you want to travel at and the pace your players want to travel at, and balance it out into a point in time that satisfies your players more than anything. It's important that your players feel satisfied with the pacing. This comes into other things that might occur during the adventures. Your characters might need to go spend some money on things. They might have some downtime. It's proper for the pacing of the game that you figure out how to roll these out or have these go out with the least amount of time. Monotonous little things that are unimportant to the game, unimportant to the entire point of the game, should be put down to very low in the pacing. You should have them go very quickly and efficiently. Bam, 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 they're done. You didn't have to do a lot about them. It's like, spend your money, you got the items, you're done. Oh, you have to make a dice roll? Make the dice roll, it's done. You don't dive deep into it unless it starts to become important to the actual storyline as a whole. Maybe they're going to this certain store to buy something, and they encounter an important person to their overall story, which they can get some more information with. Then, of course, you're going to slow down the pacing and have them role-play this situation. But if they're just going there and buying something, then speed it up a whole. Get rid of it. Go buy it. It is still important to have that scene occurring. It's just you can skip over most of it. Now you're going to want to consider each scene you're having. Each little encounter, each set of skills, each conversation, each battle, each chase, everything that happens is a scene. Whether or not you play out those scenes depends on your pacing and how much you play into those scenes, but you have to consider each of these scenes as adding to the overall story. That's what you're doing them for. So you have to look at each of these scenes individually as, this is a scene in my movie, this is a scene in my TV show, this is a scene in my book. Here's what happens to the scene, here's the conversations, the players, the items, the entire thing that goes on. We play out that scene and move on to the next scene, and it should have a natural transition between these two scenes. But each of these scenes are adding to the story, and of course, My players are going to be the major components of that scene. They're going to be the central figures of it. I might add some NPCs in, but I'm not going to be running a scene that my players aren't going to be involved in. Maybe there can be times where things can be thrown up. If your players are hiding somewhere observing two people acting, you're still focusing on your players because they're hiding, attempting not to be detected while finding out this information. But there's also this focus on the two that are discussing things without your players. But it's just a matter of the ability for you to craft these scenes in such a way that makes your characters excited to move on to the next one and ready for the next action along in the storyline. Now, the last thing I want to talk about today is how you're directing your characters into the actions you want to have them do. The fact is, your characters will go off on tangents and storylines in different ways than you expect. And you might have to basically help them through certain circumstances, but you don't want to hold their hands. When characters get into situations where they need either help or things are going badly for them, you don't want to necessarily throw them to the wolves, but you also don't want to move them through very carefully through it. You want to find a fine balance of having your characters find their own vision in that scene. Because this is, again, breaking it down to scenes. When a scene occurs that the players have come up with some kind of problem in it, you're going to edit the scene as necessary to make it that they can figure it out on their own. Maybe they need little hints. Maybe there should be some kind of NPC that they can interact with, whether as an enemy or as a friend, that can do something to help them out in a minor way that gives them that little push in order to find the way through that scene to a conclusion that might not be the one you wanted, but it's close enough to fit within the storyline. You don't want your characters changing from the heroes to villains with one scene. You want them to remain the heroes if that's the game you're playing. Granted, you could set up a scene where it could very easily have them turn to the villainous side throughout the storyline. The point is for you to create a scene that they can go the direction you want to, remaining heroes, without you holding them by their hands to that point, basically holding their hands and saying, this is where you want to go. You want them to logically want to go to the end of the scene where you want them to go, or at least close enough to it that you can work with it. So that's it for today. We dove into some of the basics of game mastering when it came to D20 Modern, and the basics of game mastering in general. So this is an important one just if you want to be a GM, and I've talked about this in other games and other formats. But every time I talk about it, it is important to give information on the way that you're going to game master a player. The next episode, I'm going to dive deeper into the general basics of game mastering for pretty much any game, and then start to dive into the game mastering of course, D20 Modern, because it has its own version of it, slightly different than any other version of game mastering. Each system does. So if you have any questions, comments, anything you say, anything you think I left out, please leave in the comments below. Please like, share, and subscribe. It shows you support the channel, the Empire, and the work I do. If you want to show some extra support, you can always check out my Patreon. Link in the description below. But regardless, until the next time, I bid you farewell.